Hi, everybody. It's very late in the night for those who are with us from the Asian continent. It's the end of the afternoon, early evening for our friends joining us on the Western time zone. It's late in the morning or still in the morning for people on the East and West Coast. Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is the second day of the ATypI Type Tech Talks 2021, and today we're having a panel discussion that's gonna spread over about 3 hours with our eminent panelists. The topic of the day was triggered by the recent de-adoption of the Vox classification by the Association Typographique Internationale. And at this occasion, we wanted to invite some of the persons whose point of view we value and we believe will be valuable to you as well in this discussion, in this general informal talk about typeface classifications, so that we can have a better informed view and share opinions and different point of views on that topic. We suggested that we would split those 3 hours in half, with the first hour and a half for our panelists to have a cross discussion. So make sure you gear up your questions, you prepare them. Don't forget to ask all those questions in the lower right side of the chat box that you have on your screen. And the second half of the panel will be dedicated to Q&As. So we look forward to your questions. Ask away, don't hesitate. There must be someone, with so many panelists, there must be someone who has an answer or an opinion on whatever question you will ask about type classifications. Hi, everybody. Hi, panelists. How are you doing? Hello. So as a warm-up, let me introduce my co-moderators. I'm Jean-Baptiste Levée. I'm from the Association Typographique Internationale. I'm here with Carolina, our beloved president, and Thomas Phinney, and Yo, the Bardo Maker, as co-moderators for this evening, because it's the evening here in Paris. And let's have our panelists introduce themselves. Maybe you can also share with us what's your relationship with the Vox classification, for a starter. Can we start with, who wants to start? Don't raise your hands all at once. Okay.
I can start.
I have, okay, Indra. Hi, Indra.
I was going to say you were just picking an order. Yes, this is 6 o'clock at the Ludwigsplatz in Saarbrücken, so we have big church bells ringing here. I'm Indra Kupferschmid, as Jean-Baptiste already said, and I'm a professor at the Art Academy in Saarbrücken, which I'm also in right now. And I got into this topic, or this topic found me incidentally around 1998. Is that correct? Yes. And via the German classification committees, and it somehow stayed with me, and I was not able to get rid of it. And this is what brought me here to this panel tonight. Was that enough, or do you want more about my life? And I don't hear anything. I think
it's perfect.
Okay. Jean-Baptiste too.
I could go next if that's helpful. So in the mid-90s, I was working in an archive, a lettering archive, and I was tasked as a research student with adding newer materials to an existing historical collection, and we needed a means of describing those materials in the context of that collection. And so, like Indra, I ended up working with classification or description. I didn't go looking for it. Who would? And it became the basis of a PhD, which I published 20 years ago.
Okay, Nadine, do you want to follow?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Hi, my name is Nadine Chahine. I'm a Lebanese type designer, usually based in London, currently in Barcelona. Most of you know me for my work of designing Arabic typefaces that sit comfortably with their Latin counterparts. And for many, many years, I've been asked to, can you design a companion to a serif or a companion to a sans serif? And what does a serif Arabic look like? So I've had to suffer the consequences of type classification while trying to discuss typeface design in general across scripts. So this is where my interest in this topic started, and I am looking forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Next in line is Manuel.
Hello, I'm Manuel Sesma. I'm living in Madrid, Spain now. And well, I'm interested in Vox classification accidentally because I wrote a PhD thesis 6 years ago now about the Graphi-Latin movement, typographic movement on the 50s in France, led by Maximilien Vox. And the classification was one of the columns of his Graphi-Latin. But after that, I was more interested in the Vox classification because of his political links and meanings more than the classification itself.
Okay, thank you. Nick?
Hello. I'm Nick Sherman. I'm from the US, currently living in Amsterdam. I make fonts and I make websites. My relationship with classification or organizing typefaces goes back to when I was in school, where my senior project was making kind of a theoretical system for organizing fonts and helping people find fonts that are relevant to their projects. From there, I got a job working at My Fonts as a designer, kind of all-purpose person. And one of the things I worked on there was trying to figure out some kind of organization system for that database. So I've thought a lot about organizing fonts and type classification and stuff like that. After that, I worked at Font Bureau, a much smaller library, easier to organize. And now I'm working at my own company called Hex Projects. I also am a co-founder of Fonts in Use, which has other kind of implications for organization and sorting things in the context of typography and graphic design. And I'm also running a site called vfonts.com, which is kind of a catalog of existing variable fonts. And I have a whole backend system there that I've been working on. It's still not public yet, but it's also for organizing everything that's in that system. So I think a lot about organizing fonts. My relationship to the Vox system is admittedly not very strong. I think I looked at it a couple times when I was doing my project, but it didn't seem particularly practical for me. The thread that's kind of run through most of my thinking of classification is less from an academic standpoint and more from trying to create some sort of way for a practical organization of type. So that's me.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I'll go. I feel like I was next in line, no? So my name is Sahar Afshar. I'm from Iran. I'm a font developer. I'm currently based in London. Yeah, I work at Delta Mog. Primarily, my own interest is designing Arabic fonts, but primary interest doesn't necessarily matter when you work in a in a company. You do what you have to do. Anyway, my relationship to Vox. Yeah, I've spent some time thinking about the ways of making inclusivity, diversity, all of these things are very much at the center of my personal and work ethos. So that's something that I'm very interested in. Working a lot in sort of the commercial side of type, also having to juggle that when speaking to clients, and of course, as Nadine already mentioned, this everlasting problem of trying to explain how not every feature from Latin is necessarily something you can carry over to other scripts. And a lot of you also know that I'm a very publicly and outspokenly against this classification, this reductive classification of non-Latin. So very happy that we're moving on from that. Yeah.
I think I'm last, right? Yes.
Yep.
Hello, I'm John Hudson. I'm a Canadian type designer, and I would characterize myself as a classification skeptic. I think we need languages to talk about type and about typography. I'm not sure that classification systems are really going to fit the purpose. And I'm mostly interested in classification as cultural artifacts, so what they tell us about the people who do the classifying and what problems they were trying to solve.
Okay, that's an interesting way to put it. Actually, this remark from Sahar leads me to my first general question. And because you've been last to speak, John, maybe you can help me answer first. How did you receive the news of ATypI decommissioning this classification?
Without much, I didn't really have any particular response to it. I mean, part of me thinks, well, I'm surprised they hadn't already done it. It seems such a historical artifact. Not only that, Vox's original idea is definitely a historical artifact in a very particular moment in French typography. And I suspect Manuel can speak about that more than I can. But its adoption by ATypI tells you something about ATypI at that moment in history. I think its de-adoption tells you something about ATypI now. I have to admit, in 25 years of professional type designer, I've never made reference to the Vox ATypI classification system in talking about type, either among my colleagues or to clients or customers. So it seems mostly irrelevant to what I do.
From the beginning, the very beginning of your career, it felt inadequate.
Well, it always struck me as strange. I mean, I think there's a kind of Anglo-American classification that sort of grew out of the kind of print and typesetting trades. Some of which has some crossover, so this idea of transitional type, is something is terminology that also shows up in the Vox ATypI system. But it was really what's sort of odd about the Vox ATypI system is some of the classifications are historical, some of them are descriptive. It's like many classification systems, it has this is basically putting labels onto boxes and then putting things into the boxes. I'm much more interested in description than classification. And I do think we need to come up with systematic methods of being able to describe things. But that's not the same as putting things into buckets and then sticking labels on the buckets.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else just cheered in joy when it was announced that we would de-adopt the classification, or did you just raise your elbows like this, like, okay,
it seemed
fine.
like, to me, it was kind of like, I mean, I would be surprised if anyone on this chat, which is like people who are very interested in classification systems, could list all of the different categories, or like, I don't know. It did, at least in my work, there were parts of it that kind of caught on. John mentioned like the idea of transitional type, but that wasn't anything particularly unique to Vox. That idea has been around for a while, and I don't know anyone who used it kind of in a practical context on any kind of regular basis, if at all.
Yeah, Nadine, I think you can unmute yourself.
Yes. No, but just to take turns, because if otherwise we're all jumping in and speaking, at some point it's going to get heated, right? So, well, you never know. I'll do my best. So I was definitely quite happy to hear the news. I would like that ATypI also decommissions the term non-Latin if we can, because that would couple the approach to classification, because the entire understanding of classification has been so mired in Latin typography, and it's understood because Latin has had more time in the light, right, to grow and to have all the different varieties and all of that. But at this point in time, you know, with everything that has gone on in the last few decades and the democratization of type technology and everything that we see, it makes sense that we start to talk about type in a way that is not so Latin-centric. And so we move away from that. But we need to couple that with the understanding that it's not Latin and non-Latin. That binary thing doesn't exist. It's Latin and world scripts, or whatever term. I myself use the term world script. And I don't want to derail the conversation, but I think it's an excellent, like John was saying, it's an excellent point in time to show where ATypI is. I was quite happy to see that ATypI is taking an initiative of leading a conversation, because it is necessary, and we look to ATypI for leading conversations, because someone has to. So definitely in the right direction, and I'm quite interested to see what will come up with all this.
Who thought it was late to de-adopt it? Did you guys thought it was late? Yeah.
No, I think lots of us had the feeling like, oh, didn't we do this 10 years ago, or wasn't this a topic for a long time? And I think to add to the points where anyone used that classification, I think nowadays it was solely in sort of more academic or educational writing about type that is usually also happening by copying other people's work that went before you, like other books inspire new books and something like this, and probably also sort of like in traditional educational institutions or informal education when you count Wikipedia and some other resources. But I don't think that any practicing type designers or type foundries deliberately sorted their catalog by this. And almost everyone used some of the terms or like some of the groups, but not others. And I feel that no one will miss it now that you put this label on a de-adoption on it. But more people than missing this will say, oh, what it is about, or why was this still around, I think.
Hmm. Catherine, how did the news came to you?
Well, a bit like Indra just said, I thought we already had. So it was a bit of an odd moment of thinking, of just checking myself. But yeah, no, it can't be a surprise. I mean, I think anybody who's tried to do anything and has looked at this has kind of gone, well, that's not enough, or that's not going to work. So, I mean, and it's been obvious for such a long time that it was of its moment. I mean, it was of its moment, but it didn't come from nowhere. That's the other thing to say about Vox. I mean, the idea of copying that Indra just talked about how that happens a lot, where people, people are writing a book about typography and then they go, oh, there's a bit about class. Oh, what should we do? Or we'll do what everyone else has done. So that it kind of gets carried along. But you can see it emerging. You can see one of the things I had to do is I tracked back from Vox into the ways that people were categorizing types before. And you can see it in a lot of the books about typography. So if you look at Morrison and you look at Johnson and you look at the way that they look at the field of typography or type design, and then you look at the chapter headings, and then you look at what happens with Vox, there's a really strong correlation. And a lot of that's being driven by market, a lot of that's being driven by monotype, a lot of that's been driven by early 20th century values about reviving typefaces. All of a sudden you're selling old faces, and then you need to expand your market, and then you introduce revivals of modern faces, and then you've got to educate printers about them. So if you look at the kind of systems for commercializing revivals in type design in the early 20th century, and the kind of languages and vocabularies that were being developed and then having to be taught to printers to persuade them that they needed one of these new things and why they needed it. There's a huge amount of investment, but the kind of categories that were being introduced correlate really strongly to the historiography of the early 20th century, which ends up being embedded with a whole lot of other values that I'm sure Manuel's going to talk to us about in the Vox system. So it's kind of, it's arguably it didn't really do its job at the time for many kinds of typeface. It's not really even biased. At the time. Yeah. No, because it just completely disregards the 19th century, because 19th century, a lot of the work that was happening in the 19th century was regarded as completely irrelevant. So if you were working in a historical archive like I was, which made a feature of that kind of work, it was absolutely useless because it's all just in one category or lumped together, because it wasn't a serif, and it wasn't a reading text space, and it wasn't where the market was really centered or the kind of education was really targeted. So yeah, I think in many ways, for many contexts and purposes, it wasn't universally applicable because it's so biased.
So ornamentals is too much of a catch-all, you're saying?
Well, the category is graphic.
Or graphic, sorry, yeah.
As it's translated into the British Standard, which then took its lead from Vox, a bit like the ATypI classification. It just, and that's anything that could be drawn. I mean, like, what couldn't be drawn? Like, it's just such a random catch-all that, and when you look at writing about Nicolette Gray's book published in 1938 about 19th century typography, and you have lovely Harry Carter, who is a writer I have a huge amount of time for, reading it and writing reviews saying, well, it's very good, but why on earth would you write about these typefaces? I mean, why would you do it? Why would you give them any attention? So you can kind of see why the sort of skew in the categorization of typefaces is towards a certain kind of typeface and not towards some other kinds of typeface. So they were being left out even then.
The catch-all of putting all of sans serifs into lineals. So even in the illustrations where you have grotesque and futura and peña all thrown into a single category, regardless of it, its Latin sceneness, it's so serif-centric that it's become increasingly irrelevant as sans serifs have become increasingly relevant. Particularly in the last 20 years in their use for so much running text now on the web and on devices. We simply can't use the Vox ATypI system even to talk about Latin typography in a sensible way.
Yes, Manuel?
Yeah, I just have to remember to remind that the main reason to take by Vox to put the linears on his classification was very simple. It's that he can't avoid it, but he wanted, because for him linears was from Germanic origin. So he was more of some people in France at the age anti-Germanics because of the First and the Second World War and blah 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 blah. So he did two things. He put the linears outside the historical boxes, and he put the Gothics on the black letters on the manuals, just to forget the German origins of typography. And it's a very Latin and serif-centric classification, indeed.
So I'm wondering if maybe it's time to, I think we've talked about a bunch of the things wrong with the Vox system and why it doesn't work too well for a variety of reasons. I'm going to throw in one little thing. Even among serif faces, there are ones that are problematic for the Vox system, and not even uncommon ones. You know, I was referring to Cambria in a legal report I was working on, and I was trying to talk about its classification, and I realized that I wasn't 100% sure how to classify it. You know, it just wasn't entirely obvious because it wasn't a historical face. It didn't fit entirely neatly. I thought, maybe it's transitional. Anyway, but what about talking for a moment about this question of whether we need classification? What's the purpose of classification? Is it a good thing to have? Do we need a classification system either in general, or does it one adopted by ATypI? Those kinds of things.
Maybe I can answer that quickly, because you said that it's not easy to classify even some of the serifs. And I think one of the biggest misunderstanding is that we still use this term classification for all of the stuff that we want to do, because what you more mean is like sort of like a typical a model of an idea of a typeface, and then other typefaces are in relation to that closer or not so close. But that as like an idea would be called a typology and not a classification. So first proposal is, can we stop using this term even if you want to come up with a system? Second proposal, should we come up with a system at all, or shouldn't we put our energy into, for instance, a publicly editable or editable by us all wiki that like defines some of the criterias or features that typefaces differ in? But to the first one, is like we had like a brief Twitter discussion the other week about this, and I always said it's sort of like a pile, and then at the top there's like maybe the most typical one, and the further away they're like a little bit more loosely related, and then it's no problem to put Cambria in there. But then Craig Eliason had like a cool term for it, sort of like a beacon. I had to think about this for a bit longer to just picture what it means, but it's sort of like if you had like the brightest light in the middle, like the most typical model like Garamond or Bodoni for one of the big groups, and then you have other typefaces that are close enough to be related to this, but it's not an either or bucket that you can put it either here or here, because we don't have physical type anymore that a shop owner has to put the typeface in one of the drawers and cannot have it in the other corner of the shop. So I don't know, in 55 or 56, it was useful to have an either or order, because you had to put it in a physical book, you had to put it in a shop, you had to, I don't know, put it somewhere. But now we don't have to put anything anywhere, and we can put it in several different places, however people want to find it again.
So it seems like you're saying two things. One, you're talking about what sounds a lot like fuzzy set theory. And the other being, you're saying we can describe typefaces without putting them into a single bucket.
Can I jump in? Yes?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so I just wanted to,
Sorry.
like going back to your question, Thomas, and taking a step back from classification into ordering systems. And we have ordering systems for any arrangement that attempts to place diverse items into some sort of order. And, clearly from the name, the objective is to, set these diverse entities into a sort of heuristic scheme. And the point of it is that it permits further and faster comprehension of all of these entities and this diversity, right? Now, classification systems are ordering systems are essential. Think of a phone book. If you ever use the phone book, it's not the most contemporary example, but I think it sort of gets that point across. So a classification is a type of ordering system, right? And the thing that's specific to a classification is when you are putting these diverse things into classes, you are doing it based on their similarity. And I think in type, the really difficult question is, in anything, the very difficult question is, what is similar? Is a snake similar to an eel? Yeah, and the overall sort of physicality, they're similar, but one is a fish and one is a reptile. So it's tricky, right? And there's more examples like that, but and it changes over time, sure. So yeah, I think the very difficult thing is, if we want to do this I agree with Indra that maybe it doesn't need to be a classification. We don't need a classification at all, but rather a way to talk about things. Because if you want to do this classification thing, you need to be able to answer this question. And I just think that it's not really easy to start to answer this question of what is similar. Emoji is not similar to Arabic. Arabic is not similar to thin triangular serifs in Latin, and none of these are similar to, I don't know, an Amharic font. Now I'm just jumping into, I'm remembering things from all the conversations over the past 2 days, but yeah, I think that's a big issue there.
I think we also need to ask, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I think we need to ask what is it that we are trying to understand, right? Classification as a first step is a way to understand and like what Sahar was saying, to bring order, right? To be able to talk about things. And so I think we have an issue of the language, of what terms we use, what terminology, and then the purpose. So when it comes, and sorry, this might take a few sentences or a few minutes to get through, but when it comes to language, it's very important the labels we use. And when we sit to describe typefaces by serif, there is an underlying assumption that the serif is the most important thing in defining the characteristic of that typeface. And I would seriously challenge that, because it's not. There are other things, right, that are also extremely important in the typeface before you even get to the serif. And so when we pick on a detail and we make that detail its presence or its absence our biggest measuring stick to be able to understand typefaces, it means that we are focusing too much on a detail and forgetting what makes the typeface a typeface, right? Whether it is structure, it is rhythm, pattern, whatever it is. So the language we use is extremely important because it helps us understand the world. And then there is the question of purpose. Is this something where, and it's not wrong to say we need a new type classification system for Latin, and to sit and discuss within a Latin-centric sphere. We have enough Latin typefaces. They deserve the attention. That is the case. But then we need to be clear. Do we want to have classification or not classification, ordering system, or whatever it is, only for Latin? Or do we want to attempt to have an understanding and a language that is able to talk about scripts that are from all over the world? And that, I think, is important that we come to a decision on that before we start even the conversation. Because like in my case, I would like to have this language where we are able to speak about many different scripts rather than the one, but it is also an extremely valid exercise to say, you know what, Latin is a big chunk of design and we need to focus on that. So this is, and there is no conflict between the two. It's just, it's very important that we know what the purpose is of the exercise and the conversation, because it will push us in different directions.
You mentioned something which is exactly what I was going to say about like kind of the order that we're looking at this in, like the question of how do we set up a classification system or ordering system or whatever is kind of putting the cart before the horse. It's like looking for a problem before you like know when you have the solution. It's like, and I think I see a lot of it in kind of the academic realm of people who are interested in organizing things. I mean, that was my senior project in school. And I think that's good, especially from a teaching standpoint, to have people look at type and letter forms and try to describe them and figure out kind of what's going on with them. But the systems that are used for describing type for students are not going to be the same systems that are the best for typeface designers or professional graphic designers who have been working for decades. So to me, it's like, why are we talking about classification systems instead of just trying to solve the problems that they're supposed to solve and looking at that as the starting point instead of as the system as the starting point? Because depending on where you're starting, I think the thing you end up with is going to be completely different. So if ATypI was going to adopt and develop a new system for describing typefaces, they would have to figure out what the target audience is, like what problem they're trying to solve, who's going to be using it the most, and then arrange things according to that with some kind of touchstone of what is the problem that you're solving. Because if you're just developing a system without a clearly defined problem, it's kind of like working in a vacuum.
I couldn't agree more with the idea that context matters, because I think that the task of finding typefaces and the kind of languages that evolve for finding typefaces are very different from the languages that you might use to historically explain. And what you want, what matters to different audiences, you know, the different aspects of. I mean, I was always interested in history, and I was always interested in explaining the visual language of typefaces as they have evolved, which is a really different task to ordering and finding typefaces in different catalogues.
Yes, I mean, just general agreement with those points. The question of whether ATypI should, come up with a new or embrace a new classification system, typology system, description system, whatever it's going to be, it seems to me it's entirely the wrong question, because there are so many different purposes that people have for needing to understand things about typefaces. And to understand things about writing systems and to understand things about text and layout, that having a system doesn't make any sense. Even the difference between needing to organize materials in an archive, like Catherine was talking about, versus organizing ways of finding fonts through an online store, for example, versus talking in a very introductory level to students, talking to students at a more advanced level. All these things are different. Yesterday, if you caught Nate Willis's talk, he was presenting what he called classification, which I think was really actually a form of description, in the context of being able to understand how that relates to differences in the fitting and spacing of typefaces, to understand what role it could have in automated spacing system. So being able to look at the ways in which different classifications or different kinds of shapes in different styles of type needed to be treated differently within a system like that. That's a very specific technical need, and his search for something that was going to be relevant and useful in that context. And he looked at the Vox ATypI system, immediately understood it was completely not useful for what he was wanting to do. Went looking at things like the Panelists system, which is a measurement system rather than a classification system per se. We need multiple systems to address the multiple ways in which people need to talk about type, organize type, think about type. And so to have a system that is the ATypI officially endorsed classification just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
I also think it's massively problematic in terms of the imposition of a very Western-centric rationalization of there being a system for describing things and imposing that on the rest of the world. So just even that idea that you could have a system and rationalize and have categories is a very Western-centric approach to knowledge and order and the fundamental kind of organization of ideas. And I think in a context of decolonial debate, I would struggle with the idea that seems really presumptive. But what I think ATypI does represent, there's debates about the globalization of knowledge and the knowledge of globalization and the kind of tensions that create. But what ATypI does represent, as Indra said earlier on, is a forum and a space where you have lots of people can come together and share. And we can I know I need to better understand a huge amount about scripts and type design practices beyond Latin, and would really welcome forums and spaces to be able to learn and share, because there's a huge amount to be learned and a huge amount to be shared. I think John Berry said something in the chat about understanding Latin within the context of world scripts. So I'd feel very uncomfortable about trying to impose any kind of system.
I think if ATypI were to take on the task of developing anything, it should probably be something that can be used by teachers as a way to help teach students to understand type better. Whether it's like a glossary of terms to describe type or just something to understand type, it seems like approaching it from kind of an educational standpoint, and maybe less so from a commercial standpoint would be the way to go. But again, like, I don't even know if ATypI needs to do that. It is helpful to have kind of centralized resources that people can use as a reference. So if you use a word that's why we have dictionaries. And having dictionaries for typographic language isn't a new thing. And I think that is probably, if I was going to develop any kind of system that ATypI would kind of promote, if anything at all, it would be more of a glossary of terms than some kind of formalized, structured system that has to be kind of very regimented in how it organizes things.
So it would be like a meta view on type, where if we're strictly looking at things from an educational perspective, classifications would be an item. It would be like a part of the curriculum where we look at it from a historical perspective, but it will only be a single item from the curriculum, and the glossary will be another one, right?
Well, I'm not teaching classification in my classes, and
that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying maybe history of classifications.
Or this is even less relevant to students of design. Why do they want
classification
to know?
of class?
Yeah, so you might mention something about type history, but even there I have an approach that is not linear, because that is always boring them to death at the beginning, and you want to excite them at the beginning and then maybe fiddle in the boring parts in between when they cannot hide anymore or something like this. But what I use a lot is, of course, showing them different traits in typefaces and talking about what to look for if they're picking a typeface, like how do you notice the differences? How do you know or learn how these differences influence the work that you're using this typeface for, and stuff like this? And this can be perfectly done with a set of descriptors and terms. And the only other part that I see this practical for, like all of our practice, is because I also worked on practical applications of these systems for font vendor websites. Like I worked like with Nick's system at My Fonts. Then I did a lot of work for Font Shop and now for FontStand. And there is, of course, almost everywhere with a bigger catalog a need for a filtering system or functionality or something. And what may be confusing is if every single site or font vendor is using different terms and different ways to filter down fonts, because that is confusing beginners or lay people who are looking for a typeface quite a bit. And of course, I don't think that something like Adobe fonts or My Fonts not at all anymore, or Monotype would be impressed if ATypI comes up with, here, this is our system, please use this on your website for font filtering. They will think like, well, no, we're putting wedding first and sunshine and every single tag that customers are looking for. So who are we to even, I don't know, tell the customers how they want to find their fonts? But at least if there's sort of like a resource where someone in, I don't know, Argentina who wants to set up a type shop could go and see, oh, these are the most common terms that you would differentiate some Latin types that I could use for the system that I'm implementing on my website, then this could be a resource that also has some translation added to it. I started once like this Google document where we just translated different letter forms or parts of letter forms into, I don't know, 20 different languages, and that is the best resource I've had in the past years, because this is finally where you can go and maybe find the good translation. Then maybe you can also auto-translate a website and make sense of it and something like this. So I don't think there's a practical use for a system, and I agree that it's also very presumptuous that ATypI is even, I don't know, thinking of it being the authority to propose something like this. So why just not discontinue it at all and not replace it with anything? Why do you want to replace it? Or is that sort of like the wish of ATypI as an entity to come up with something because you don't want to, like, because you had something before, you don't want to replace it with nothing? Or what's your plan?
I would love to tell you we have a plan. No, the main question right now is there something to do next? And you're pointing it in your own words. The reason why we're having this conversation is because, as you suspected, we want to know what we would like to do next. And I'm fairly confident in saying that we don't know what to do next. We are fairly open. It's about the fact of knowing that we don't know, you know. And we have a gut feeling, we or I can speak only personally maybe, I have a good feeling that it should, a new classification is probably not the right answer. And there seems to be a consensus on this today and in the association's past discussions. I think we're also maybe underestimating the fact that we've always been a balance between the educational world and the professional world. And some of you here are mainly in the academic realm. I have a foot in both the teaching and the actual professional doing. So there's this balance, this tension point between which the association always navigated. And Nick's suggestion in that regard of having providing a glossary mainly aimed at educational purposes is one good direction. However, as the Vox classification did not really sprung from an educational need, but more from a commercial or capitalistic need, I think the association should also question itself in terms of where does it stand, what's its position between the professional world, the educational world, the industrial world, the capitalistic and economical world. Where does it overlap? And there's a massive overlap of all those areas, and that's the exact definition of what the ATypI is. We are a global forum for discussion. And so the bottom line is maybe we for sure want to ask around and gather feedback or input in order to have some, I don't know, maybe Carolina, you should complement what I'm saying, because I am really freestyling right now. But we want to devise and provide something that's useful, not necessarily a tool or a glossary, but something that's useful for future professionals and current ones. So future professionals may not just students in design, but also future book historians or future scholars and professionals. I'm not sure I'm making any sense, but
no, I think what we actually are asking is what our community and our membership wants. So I think that ATypIs Core is actually to serve the community and not to make up rules by themselves, but that's my opinion. So this is why we're having this panel discussion, and I'm very happy that there is progress in this involvement. Yeah.
I'll just add that it's not like there was a general consensus among the board either. So one of the reasons that the de-adoption took so long is, frankly, the board couldn't agree on, should we replace it? Should we just cancel it? What's the right way forward? So even the ATypIs board does not have one clear mind on this, and that's part of why we thought this was a good idea to have this panel.
And this also explains why there is. You maybe have the feeling there's an emptiness, or we're leaving a hole, because it already took quite a while to put things in motion and to only decommission the classification and not replace it. I reread a few email threads from 2010s, 2015, and 2019, where it was already discussed on the ATypI mailing list, or apparently also in board discussions. And it was high time we made that move. And the first step, the smallest step, the lowest hanging fruit, was to decommission the classification. What to do next is a question. It is an open question right now, and we haven't put it in such a structured way that we can clearly answer what we want, what we will do next.
There's in terms of what ATypI is as an organization, the point that Catherine made about it being a forum, and it's a way more international forum than it was when I went to my first ATypI conference in the mid-90s. So I think the association could take advantage of that in terms of building new kinds of resources. So something, Nick's point about glossaries, one of the things that is most useful to me as a professional is not kind of classification of stars of typefaces, but having a terminology to talk about the structure of typefaces. And this is one of the things that Latin has developed over time, and it's extremely useful because I can talk about X height, and everybody knows in the profession knows what I mean. Like they know what ascenders are and descenders are. We have this whole terminology to talk about bowls and counters, and some of that terminology can be applied fairly directly to other writing systems. Other writing systems also have their own terminology, their internal terminology that is developed either in type or in scribal cultures to describe the structure of those writing systems. Very often, even for people who are working with those writing systems, that terminology isn't immediately evident to us. So there's if you come at Arabic, for example, just through type, there's a whole terminology used by calligraphers that you might not be aware of because there isn't the same kind of interchange and exchange between calligraphers and type designers in that world as there has been certainly in the 20th century in the Latin type world, where you get people like Hermann Zapf being involved in bridging that gap between calligraphers and type designers. So that's the kind of terminology that I would actually find useful to have an international resource on. And ATypI as an organization is possibly in a place to be able to start gathering that information and having those conversations with people around the world coming from their own script traditions to say, how do you describe your writing system? What are the terms you use for the shapes that occur within it and their relationships to each other?
But I think just to extend on that even more, I don't think it's necessarily, because that makes it feel a little bit like, and I know you didn't mean this, John, but look, we want to learn more. So, but I think it feels a little bit as in other scripts might be in servitude to the benefit of us. And I don't think what ATypI affords is a space for every script tradition to be arguing about its own terminologies, because every script tradition is going to be going, well, what do we call this? And how do we deal with this? And actually what it becomes is a space to be able to surface and all of those sorts of discussions and maybe channel them in a space which for the benefit of other people. But as much as people within traditions to argue, as much as for other people outside of those traditions to learn from. Because I don't assume that everyone else around the world knows exactly what it is that they're doing either.
Yeah, and I've seen, for example, just taking description of structure of Arabic. I've seen multiple attempts in multiple languages to describe the structure of Arabic, and it's clear, the people doing that are not necessarily going to agree with each other. So then there's a whole, providing a forum, a place for conversations to happen is a useful thing. I've had my problems with the association over the years. I think sometimes ATypI imagines itself to be more important than it is. These conversations are already happening in the world. And if ATypI offers a forum in which them to happen, the response from some people might be, that's okay, we have our own forums in our own languages, and we don't really need you, and that's fine. It's not everything has to be centralized. If an association like ATypI can provide a place for its members, that's a start. But shouldn't expect everyone is just going to come flocking as a result.
If I can add a little bit on the last couple of interventions, I think and ATypI can decide to do whatever it wants to do. Personally, I'm always in support of structures of cooperation across different parts of the world, different cultures, different languages and scripts. That is always, for me, the right place to start. When it comes to like what could we do, I think, and here coming from a type designer who does not want to design Latin and rarely designs Latin, but has to speak about her type design to people who design Latin all the time. I think sometimes we need to step back a little bit and to look at the reasons why letter forms look the way they do, whether it is from the motor skills, what is the hand is able to write, and from the visual part, what the eye is able to recognize. This is the basis of why letter forms look the way they do. And there is quite a bit of literature on letter identification that talks about commonalities across scripts, why most characters would have 2 to 3 strokes, because that's fast and that's easy to recognize, right? So there's a lot of commonalities, obviously Chinese, big exception, but there are commonalities as to why letters look the way they do. But when it comes to Latin, type design in particular, we have different schools that argue or discuss about why letters look the way they do. There is, maybe there are more schools, let's not classify, but there is one approach that looks at punch cutting as sort of the driving force, and I've had teachers like that, where it's the driving force of why letters look the way they do. It's what the punch cutter did, it's the counter punch, it's all of the effects of printing and all of that, and that's the letter. And then there is another, approach that looks at the, the moving front line and the effect of the hand movement and calligraphy and the ductus and the axis and the structure of the letter form. And that comes from a different tradition as well. And I think all of these approaches are viable. But if we really wanted to get to the commonalities really of every script, it's the fact that the tool has traced a shape on some form of medium, whether it is your, cutting in stone, whether it's a brush writing on stone, whether it's a brush or a nib on paper or vellum or whatever it is. There is a tool and there's a structure that it followed, and there's the angle at which the tool was held and cut, right? And these have created shapes that have become letter forms identified by millions of people worldwide, whether they are Latin or Arabic or Hebrew or Chinese or Japanese, is all the same in the end, right? It's a series of movements. And so, there will always be a space for classification, because that's how we speak. They are de facto. They are the reality on the ground. A client comes, we want a geometric sans serif. These days, they want geometric sans serifs all over the place, right? And so these classifications, whether ATypI says is formal or informal, they exist, right? But I think what would be interesting is to bring forward new ways of discussing type. One, to raise awareness that not everything in Latin can cross the boundary into other scripts. So let's not take over exactly, come and say, what is the X height in Arabic? We don't have an X height, we have something else, right? But also to be able to have these conversations across the scripts. And when I teach type design, and when I talk to clients about why is this Arabic working with this Latin, I'm talking about structure, about contrast, about the nature of the movement, how mechanical is it, how organic is it. The reasons why the letter forms look the way they do is because of that movement, even if at the end of the day, the typeface is not handwritten. It looks super mechanical, but there is that movement that created the shape. And these are intrinsic to why letter forms look the way they do, and going back and sort of taking a step back away from everything that we've learned at type design, go back to being a child, right? And to look at the letter forms in the essence of what they are, and then see the commonalities, and then open these avenues for discussion so that we are able to speak across the scripts. We are able to say, okay, I am designing now in Latin, I need to match in Arabic, or we're making this big multilingual family. How do you get the scripts to live together on the same page? Sorry, the puppy is playing. Anyways, so, all of these types of conversations, for me, ATypI has lots of pros and cons, but I would love for ATypI to encourage these conversations. And I think the forum today where we are is an excellent start for having these types of conversations and a what is the plurality of opinion? and because that really is the best place to start. And there's a lot of decisions that have been forced on scripts that are not Latin because of how we talk about Latin. So fixing the way we talk about type is I think, the first step, at least for me. Thank you.
I can follow up on that one.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just I wanted to say I don't think anyone here really seems to be disagreeing. I think everyone is sort of in agreement that maybe we don't need a classification system at all, and that's fine. We just need a way of talking about things, and first of all, defining who anything is going to be done for moving forward. I think in terms of the Arabic script, which has been mentioned a few times, I mean, a lot of the times I talk to clients and they don't even need a classification, right? At most, we will reference a calligraphic style, which is the common approach with Arabic. And, the funny thing is, when we do that, that's the time that I actually find the most difficulty. A lot of clients will come, and I don't know if, Nadine, you've had this experience or not, but clients will come to us and say, can I have a Kufi typeface or logo? And this just becomes like a long email thread where you have to actually figure out, do you actually want a classic Kufi that looks something like that? Or are you talking about the uniform sort of geometric style that is very popular in some countries? And then we have to have a whole conversation where we walk through what it is that they actually want, or we workshop it until we find out what it is. So even that system sometimes does not fall through because a lot of designers have maybe called that style Kufi, and that has created an expectation to certain clients. So I think in that sense, sometimes it's very useful to have a, like I said, like others said, actually, a sort of glossary of sort of agreement on some terms of, this is what we mean when we say this. Not that it's that difficult to have that conversation anyway. That's also fine, a bit of a carbon email footprint, but otherwise fine.
I think something that is important for, if ATypI even does need to have any kind of centralized resource for people to use when they're talking about type, I think a very important aspect of that is something that made the Vox system problematic in the first place, was that it was just kind of this monolithic thing that was dropped down, and it was like, here's the system, like anything you invent in the future has to be kind of shoehorned into this system. And if you look at other kind of standards that exist today, like the W3C standards, they're more like living documents that can be updated as things change culturally and with technology, and just how people approach design. Putting forward any kind of single thing and saying this is the thing and this is how you have to think about whatever is not going to be very helpful, especially over time. I think it's better to create a system that allows people to understand better what exists, but also understand what doesn't exist, and how to kind of think beyond just the categories that already are popular in the world.
That's an interesting aspect of classifications of the past. I know Radek shared with me a classification from the Czech Republic, and it was one of the purposes were to reveal the kinds of work that didn't yet exist. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, because most of our approaches to classification are about taking what there is and putting it in a box. And actually one of the spin-offs of this was it generated types, or the typology generated the types that didn't actually exist yet but could exist. So it's an interesting way of thinking about classification as a generative system, as opposed to something which we don't think.
If I can just follow on, I think you've really hit it on the nail. When we describe our design space as a series of rooms, and every room is a category, and that room is defined by certain characteristics, we've already put barriers to the creativity of any type designer wanting to design within that space. And if you look at, you know, the genres of grotesques and geometric sans serifs, you know, these days, there's so many copies, there's so many typefaces that they're just iterations of the same idea over and over and over, because that space has become so enclosed and so crowded that everything looks the same. And that cannot be something we are comfortable with. But that's a different panel discussion, but anyways. But at the heart of it is this approach that we define typefaces by these rooms that are closed. So if you say, I want to design a geometric sans serif, 90% of the decisions have already been made, because this is how geometric sans serifs look like. But we don't live in that kind of mentality anymore. We are now living in the mentality of variable fonts. We have stripped down design characteristics into variables that can be changed and manipulated, and where creativity can be unchained, so that we are able to explore the design space and push the design space bigger, so that there is less crowded, you know, design rooms that we have, where everything looks like everything else, and you need to be an expert in type design to be able to tell the difference between two typefaces, right? So it is exactly that approach of recognizing variability rather than a fixed approach of saying this is a category and you design in it, but not. So these are very different approaches that we could take to designing typefaces. And I think there's a lot that can still be explored, more rooms that are waiting to be opened, if we go with what we already have as variable fonts. That approach of recognizing variables that can be manipulated and that can give those surprises that I'm sure are still waiting for us. It cannot be that we finished with all the design categories in Latin. It cannot be, right? We need more. There is more, for sure there is more, but where are they? So we need to push those walls, right? And bringing a variable approach to our understanding and the way we speak about type can perhaps help us push those walls a little bit wider.
Yeah, I also think this thing of, you know, like, you know, you say there are things that exist outside of these categories, and that's absolutely true. I think there are a lot of people, I mean, we're designers and creatives. Once you, and, you know, tell someone it's a geometric and that's the category, it might be that people actually try to add something to it that's, you know, not. And a lot of the fonts that are coming out these days don't fit in any one category. And people are, you know, intentionally trying to go against that. And I think there's a really there's beauty in that, you know, because with categorizations there's this penchant for dramatizing general features, and you're reducing big things into these small orderable types, describable types. And yeah, there, you know, we were talking earlier with Jose, and, you know, this, if you go on future fonts now, he was making a good point. If you go on future fonts now, what are you going to put 90% of the fonts there on the Vox circle? It's an interesting challenge.
The idea of
It's funny. I think a lot of graphic designers obviously think about type differently from type designers, and most of the people within the realm of ATypI are very focused on kind of terminology that's pretty specific, but it's something that most graphic designers don't really care about. There was a short tweet thread the other day where I said something about bonkers italics, and I think it was Kyle Reed said that should be an official category of typefaces. And I think there are probably a lot of graphic designers that would rather, or that would find more use in a list of typefaces with bonkers italics than typefaces that are, you know, humanist construction or something like that. And it's kind of, it goes back to what Sahar was saying about typefaces now, that, for example, on future fonts, you see a lot that don't really fit into these kind of neat systems. But there is a value in being able to group things together and see them kind of presented in kind of a series or a list or something. If not for finding things that you want to use in your own graphic design, but also for helping people understand kind of the differences and similarities between typefaces, which is what I hate to kind of sound like a broken record, but going back to this idea of having a system that's much more flexible and loose instead of trying to make it more kind of monolithic and official and formal, and just kind of allowing for a space for things to be kind of discussed almost more than formally defined.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I also think that even when a classification has a logic to it, this is something I read in a book, and I'm not remembering the book, but this is not me. I'm, you know, paraphrasing. When there is a logic to an ordering or a classification, the rules of the logic of how one style is a symbol for example, let's say the rules of how one style can be a symbol of modernity in one society and archaic in another, these are not predictably rational or universal, right? So we really cannot sort of project how that will be everywhere. So there's always this measure of purely arbitrary in the way the distinctions between things are seen. So yeah, I mean, regardless of what, I don't know, a group of experts will get together and say, whether it's actually acknowledged on the other side is an entirely different thing.
I think there's something about, if you think about how, so if we, for want of, I mean, Indra's right about whether we call things typologies, taxonomies, classifications, they all mean slightly different things. And the idea of a single classification where things are in a box, I think pretty much everyone here would just say, yeah, it's hopeless. The idea that you could have something that kind of crosses between some sort of layering, filtering system, whereby it's sort of imposing increasing sets of tags or to delimit and kind of start to cluster things. It seems to be an approach that many people are kind of tending towards in their practice and how they're working in different situations. But I think one thing is really interesting is the idea of an overview and the extent of a territory, and how is that visualized and communicated? And I think that is something that can become important in a field of practice, and it can become important when you're teaching, which is that being able to step back and have some sense, you know, it's like the map in front of you and you have some senses of edges and all the possibilities within that, but something that's some kind of representation of a field of practice and possibility helps you make sense of the relative position of the ways that things are being described, and that can become quite important in terms of recognizing patterns.
Yeah, I was also questioning this, does it have to be in order when Sahar mentioned a phone book? Because I think this is a good example of that. Everyone maybe wants to look for something different. So you might want to approach it from like the standpoint of a place that you need something like in your neighborhood, or you want to approach it, you're looking for a certain profession, or you look for a name, then you want the alphabetical order. And that's also the problem with the one image that you can put on your wall of this system, that do you put serifs or stroke endings first? Do you put stroke contrast first? For me, it is usually like sort of like a form principle that is most important. And I see that when I had to like come up with systems for these websites, that every time I talk to a different audience, I might want to have a different hierarchy or order. And that's also why I think like the one taxonomic system where you have a defined order is very limiting, because you want to come it from the right angle or the left angle, and that's the good thing if you just sort of like have a selection of more important descriptors and maybe more niche descriptors, then you can at least put any of these descriptors first, because I think this is very different if you're choosing a typeface with the help of a book or a website, or if you're a student learning about something. And I actually made some tests with students who were like really first year or lay people, and let them sort a lot of typefaces to however they want to sort them, to figure out what is the most important feature of a Latin typeface. Because we always say serifs, but maybe this is not what they are looking for, or something, to find out if there's an order of descriptors or something. And yeah, it was pretty boring what I found out. So the serifs were the first thing that they differentiated, but then stroke contrast was much more prominent in what they differentiated than I imagined it. Like to the minute stroke contrast, where I had to say like, no, this is not even meant to be seen. It's supposed to look linear. So I think I don't even trust these tests, and that's also why I don't trust a hierarchy in these descriptors or features that we might want to define. But that's I think there's not one graphic that we can make for teaching or for on a website or in a book or something, although I understand that there's a need for this.
No, they're really seductive, though. I find myself really drawn to the systems, but the reason why is because they make it all look really manageable when it's not. But it's very seductive.
There's a parallel to what Indra was just describing, which is in trying to order and structure large typeface families. And this is an issue that came up in the development of the variable fonts in OpenType, that how do you, once you've got this massive variable design space with all these different axes, if you're trying to identify an instance somewhere in that space and be able to then to sort of give it a name, or describe that area of the space, even if it's not a specific instance. We didn't want to be in a situation where we were going to add yet more name fields to the OpenType name table, and still have the same problems that we were already having, where some people consider width to be more important than weight, and other people consider weight to be more important than width. And so the ordering of bits of names in typeface families was never being consistent. So that's what led us to the idea of the stat table, where you had a table, instead of having names for parts of the space, you would have discrete attributes for those parts of the space, such that names could be derived from those if names were needed. What I always liked about the idea was that the names could be customizable. So a user dealing with instantiated fonts from a variable design space in a font menu wouldn't necessarily have to accept the type designers or font developers naming system, but could say width is more important to me, X height proportions are more important to me than these other things. Sort this menu in that way that is relevant to what I'm doing. I think something similar can be done in the area of typeface style description more generally, where if we have a system of descriptors, you can then create the kind of overviews that Catherine's talking about, where you can say, I want to see an overview of this kind of designs and their relationships to each other, and then be able to manipulate that by saying, actually, this aspect of it is more important to me. I want to see the stroke contrast, for example, as the relationship between these designs. Quite a lot of my fellow panelists have been involved in working on with font distributors, coming up with systems for filtering and searching and finding, and that is definitely one of the primary uses for classification or tagging or these sorts of things. One of the things I have, in the same way that the stat table allows the font to carry with it some information about how it can be looked at. Do we want to consider the possibility of a font carrying its descriptors with it, such that filtering systems can query the font and can populate themselves? So rather than coming up with a classification scheme where you come up with boxes and then you try to cram things into the boxes, you have the font come along and say, I can put myself into this box, and I can put myself into this box. And if you want to come up with a new box, I might be able to put myself into that as well, based on these descriptors.
But because those tags are would be decided by the font itself, you'll automatically expose yourself to a chaotic system where even spelling is an issue.
Yes, and as soon as you're dealing with natural language tags, there's also the question of localization. So does the font need to localize itself to be searchable in a German website as well as in a French one, an English one, etc.? I think this is why Panos went with measurement. That simply having a set of numbers derived from measurements means you can totally avoid that. Then Panos decided not to avoid it by sticking labels onto the numbers, but that's not actually a necessary part of the process.
Yeah.
I think there's actually big problems with relying on the people who are making the fonts to also be kind of deciding what the terms to describe them are. Speaking as someone who worked at my fonts, and part of my job at the time was to kind of moderate the tags for what people were submitting to my fonts, which I don't know if they even moderate them anymore. It's complete chaos. People would just add whatever they thought was going to get them highest on the list of whatever the most popular search is. Yeah,
is 90% off,
which is why I like kind of something where people who are actually using the fonts are actively involved, instead of just type designers navel gazing and coming up with terms that only type designers care about.
I certainly wouldn't necessarily rely on type designers to come up with a system, but if a system were presented to them that made sense and was useful, it would make things easier.
So I'm definitely in favor of taking such an approach, and it fits with how I teach type design, how I design, how I look at communication across different scripts. And I do have ideas on what we need to do with that, but that is just me, obviously. And there's a couple of people I ask questions about when we talk about these things. But these are the types of conversations that are so interesting, right? And what are these variables? What are these type descriptors? What do they mean? And what do they mean per script? And can we carve out a space where we can talk about script-specific issues, right? Because even if we come up with a way to describe type, there are still specifications that are quite narrow and local. And we need to be able to, paint with a broad brush, but without losing the sensitivity to what is specific to every script. So there's, we go back to the same question from the beginning of the panel. What is the purpose? And so some of us will be interested in how do we teach type. Some of us will be interested, how do we talk about type as type designers? And then there will be the commercial aspect. How do we make the selling of or licensing of type easier so that customers are not, drowning in all the different tags we throw at them so that the tags become meaningless, right? So I think it's good to perhaps recognize that there is not one size fits all, that perhaps in one case we need something and in another case we need something else. But for me as a start, the conversation is the most important part.
I think to add to that list of things, I think Juan raised a really interesting point in the chat, which is where is the power in this and who benefits from this? And I think we always need to be thinking about the the generosity of sharing knowledge, but then the opportunities for monetization and where the power, especially I think when it comes to the kind of power dynamics of other scripts, and just in terms of the kind of forces of globalization and whether those are intrinsically good or exploitative at some other levels as well.
Absolutely, and I think it's the labels that we use that are so important. That's why, you know, even if a glossary is not what we come up with, but at least ways to talk about type, importing or forcing the term serif on Arabic is something that I personally would, you know, argue strongly against, but I've seen adopted by many. But it's not just that. Like in politics, if you are an asylum seeker versus a refugee, your legal status is different. If you are, from a sociocultural point of view, if you are an immigrant or if you're an expat, is also a different thing. Expat means you're white and probably British living in Spain. Immigrant is more someone from my country working in the UK, right? That's how it is. You know, that's how we use these terms, but they have implications on your job prospects, your ability to take a loan in a bank, your ability to live life. And so I think you're absolutely right that it's important that we bring plurality of voices into this conversation, because otherwise, again, it's one side forcing on the other. And what I've seen is it's not that there is malice, right, from people who are entrenched in one typographic tradition or one script tradition, that they want to use the terms that they want to use, right? It's just these are the words that they know. And so our job, if we wanted to expand the language that we use to describe type, is for us to expand that vocabulary so that people don't have to fall back on using the same words that are very specific to one script tradition and to force it upon the other. So it's really an expansion of our vocabulary that will bring with it an expansion of a worldview as to how we look at type.
I think I might even go a step further, and I think I feel uncomfortable with the idea of expansion. I actually think it's about reframing, and it's about maybe kind of going, well, what do we, because that sort of suggests that we're going to be incorporating other things, and I wonder if there's a sort of stepping back and going, actually maybe there's a recentering or there's a relocation, and actually a more fundamental repositioning.
And just to continue on that, I think there's also, you know, again, going back to the question of who are we doing this for, regardless of what, you know, let's say in the context of this glossary, who is going to be using it, it's still going to be English-speaking world, I think, right? Because let's say you are a group of people and you set yourself up in a territory, you draw walls and you call everyone on the other side barbarians. You do not require the barbarians to accept that, right? You've just designated them as such. And let's say that a glossary is set up and all the terms are in English, and it's very, you know, it's decentralized, it's got all of the right wording and everything, but just thinking from my own background, are people in Iran going to use it? Type designers, font developers? No, they're not. They have their own language. They don't need something that, you know, goes into deep descriptions about how the Arabic script works. Everybody knows what everyone's talking about. They visually on cue will be able to talk about things very quickly. So again, I think that it just goes back again to this question of who's going to be using it. And yeah, I mean, of course, what you're both saying is very important, obviously, but just, you know, it's a balance at the end of the day to, like, for establishing all these parameters.
Vox is looking at us and he's telling us that now is a good time to take questions from the audience. As a matter of fact, we have compiled about 24, 25 questions in no particular order from the audience. Thank you everyone who contributed. There's still plenty of time if you want to ask some more questions to our panelists.
Is it possible for us to just get like 2 minutes break?
just to read the questions.
Like Ada's reading the questions, there's filling a glass of water, and there's running to the loo.
This is Vox's face to your question. It's like, what?
I think John is way ahead of you, Kat.
Yeah,
okay, so let's wait until John comes back, and then we take turns to make breaks. No, I'm just fooling around. Okay, let's have a few minutes break and
get some drinks, people.
Yes, I'm gonna. This is now authorized to get beers, so I'm also getting a beer.
Same. See you guys on the other side then.
I might take a longer break. I need to feed the puppy, okay?
I will post in the chat that we will be resuming in 10 minutes. Okay? I hope this will be good.
Okay.
So I will not put in a time because people are all over the world.
So in the meantime, I can share my portfolio of Vox pictures for the general entertainment of the audience. This is Eloquent Vox. And here I have Golden Tooth Vox. As you can see, he seems like a cheeky fellow. So I have your angry Uncle Vox, very not approving. This is also Vox looking down at you, not really being happy with the jokes I'm making right now. And here's a popular Vox. As you can see, he was surrounded by a lot of people. I used to have, So it maybe the historian amongst you have noticed that this person here is Charles Penniot. So I can imagine, because they were sitting next one to another at dinner, they were getting along well.
C'est pas Penniot celui-là.
C'est pas Penniot? Attends, c'est pas Charles Penniot?
No. This is the writer.
So this is not Charles Penniot.
No.
I was just told wrong.
He's the writer and the poet.
Gide.
What's his name? Gide. Oui, Antoine Gide.
Okay. So. And of course, the clapping Vox, but this will be for the end of the day, to cheer us collectively and mutually.
Jean-Baptiste, did you have ATypIs dossier?
So right here I have a few dossiers. This is the dossier Vox. This is not from ATypI. This is from Association des Compagnons de Lure. So technically, Lure is the oldest type association, shortly followed by ATypI in the early 60s, in the late 50s. But Lure was founded, I think, not more than 5 years before ATypI. So it's a massive, you can see, that's where I got the pictures. It's an archive of Vox's work. It's not exactly the definition of an objective and critical examination of the career of Vox, But Manuel can tell us so much more about that, especially about the controversial parts. But I have.
Oh yes, Joe. Joe also has showed in the screen. Yeah.
Okay. Yo, did you show this? So this is one of the.
Please go ahead. No worries.
Oh, okay, no problem. This is one of the existing document that show the connection between the Association Typographique Internationale, the French-speaking type scene. We have the Belgian Fernand Baudin here. It was printed in Belgium, and this, although it does not mention the Rencontre de Lure, it's this more or less the same people behind that somehow hard to find document. Same printers. You have stuff by Michael Twyman. I'm pretty sure Dick Duyes. Am I saying that right? And so on. And as much as I'm having fun talking about Vox, I think we should also pay some tribute to Fernand Baudin, and the Belgians here. Yeah, all the Belgians are like yes, because in the year 2015, after Fernand, there was this very nice publication prepared by Colin Sullier and Charles Mazet, which is a compilation of documents and letters by Fernand Baudin. Baudin put together one of my favorite type education book. It was a foundational book that I discovered when I was a student. 1 second.
Am I the only one who actually came back with a drink?
No.
No, Sahar, you didn't.
Okay. Cheers.
It's there. Okay.
Not the only one.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Cheers.
In the frame. I have the English edition of that somewhere, but it's also a fun type education book, almost entirely done by hand. Yeah, with super nice illustrations.
Oh, cool.
Super accessible. Also very opinionated. Very, very opinionated. I will pass on the moderating handle for a while because I have also a document from Graphie Latine, which is the actual manifesto of the Graphie Latine. Manuel, you know about that book?
Which one?
It says Graphie Latine only.
Let me see.
But I was desperately looking for it before we started, and I couldn't. But that's the story of my life.
I have. This one.
No. It's a leaflet.
Because here is the foundational principles of the Graphie Latine somewhere. Let me see if I found it. Because the Caractère Noël was the unofficial magazine of the Rencontre de Lure, because there was an annual publication that appears appeared in where is that? In Christmas. Wow. Voilà.
And there we have the Vox, the original Vox wheel. So not all of this made it into the Vox ATypI classification.
No, actually, that was not the original one. The original one was in the character.
Caractère Noël.
No, July.
Caractère.
Oui, July 54. And I'm looking for. It's the first time that they describe its classification. What the biologie des caractères d'imprimerie là. This is on Caractère Noël 55, and his defense and illustration of the letter.
Yes.
And here's some of the stuff of the Rencontres de Lure. Merlet, Dick Dorius. And well, here's the description of the original groups of the Vox classification, the manners, the Gerald, no, yes, humanist. Well, and all that.
So you mentioned controversy. Let's hear about the controversy.
Who just spoke? Is it you, John?
Yeah. I want to hear about the controversy.
Controversy. Excellent. Well, okay. This document says very little about the career of Maxu, as we can surname Maximilien Vox. It says very little about the career of Maxu during occupied France in the 1940s. So we have very little traces of what he was up to during that time. Manuel, can you enlighten our audience about what Vox was up to during occupied France in the 1940s?
Wow. He
passing on the ball to you.
He was the director of the propaganda office of the Vichy government.
So the Vichy government, Vichy is a city in France where the French government, which in an authorized form by the German, the Nazi administration, was administrating France. So working for the government of Vichy during the 1940s meant that you would proactively collaborate, to put it in very factual terms.
Even if he joined the resistance after the final German occupation of France on October 41. He was a sergeant of combat.
Okay. So he was a sergeant in the French resistance when in 1941 the whole of France was overrun by the Nazi administration.
Yeah, actually the whole French patriots go back to the resistance.
Do you want to start the questions from the participants?
Sure.
Okay.
Please.
Sure.
So
Okay.
if I think that Jean-Baptiste, if you read the questions out loud, and then maybe, well, you know who to answer this question.
All right. So questions goes like this. If I am not mistaken, the German DIN classification is derived from the Vox classification. Are there any efforts to work towards the decommission of the current DIN classification as well? Well, lucky us, we have a member of the DIN committee here in our panel, if I'm not mistaken.
A member of the Dean Committee, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so is the British standard based on the Vox classification, and many other countries have adopted this sorting but figured out their own terminology. That was the intention back then. And the German DIN classification has since been tried to revise several times. The first that I saw, or like that I witnessed, was the one mentioned in 1998, where I got involved, and then the committee disbanded again because we didn't come to a conclusion how we wanted to have the new system work out. A similar situation like here, so I have kind of a flashback a bit. And in general, it's so that the standardization committees have to look at every standard every 5 years and say if they want to keep it as is, if they want to change something, or if they want to retract it. And over the years, that came up several times, but it was postponed. And the last time it came on our desk to review if we want to retract it or change it or keep it as is. We were actually discussing if we want to retract the standard. But the problem is a little bit that 2 or 3 years before we worked on the standard for like on legibility and readability, and we were actually making reference to certain types of or kinds of genres or kinds of typefaces, especially in the sans serif department, where we differentiated all of the sans serifs that you could recommend or not recommend, and separated it like in we would not recommend geometric sans serifs because of their poor readability for something like signage systems, but like the humanist kind of sans serifs, this genre, we would recommend. So we found ourselves at a point where we had to refer to something that actually subdivided the sans serif category further so that we could use it or make this a more sensible reference in these other standards. And also, of course, as it is with standards, lots of other standards are referring to it. So it's actually quite hard to retract something completely in such a system, which, to remind ourselves, ATypI is not. You do not have this problem to retract anything. But so we decided to not retract it, but to rework it. And this has been ongoing work for 2 years now, I think, so that we want to come up with a sorting or, I don't know, system, if you can call it this, that definitely references different subgenres in the slab serifs area, or like serifs with low contrast and sans serifs that are subdivided so that this reference in these other standards makes sense. And we had the same discussions as are going on here, of course, also within the committee. And I think we're tending towards keeping it simple because like we talked so much, and as always, if you have a room full of experts that talk for 2 years, it becomes bigger and bigger and more complex. And I want this category, I want this category, but no, we could also, you know, the Germans also love to categorize all of their black letters, and that comes on top of it. And so now we tend to do something quite simple and focus on exactly what we were discussing here also, a very extended section of this norm that we actually want to take out as a separate thing about terminology, description of the differences in typefaces, so that this is also a foundation for all of the standards that are referring to type and lettering, so that we don't have to repeat the section about the terminology in the beginning of a standard. So before you explain what you want to explain, you explain all the terminology that you're going to use within a standard. And that is, of course, repeated in similar standards over and over. So we actually want to make sort of like a standard terminology or glossary, and then have a sort of more future-proof, simple, I don't want to say bare bone, but not too extensive classification. We still call it classification, because that is what we need for the other standards. And now I'm probably getting a long email from Albert Jan Pohl.
Okay, +1 if you want to write long emails to Indra Kupferschmid. Next question is, are emoji fonts already a new category? Who wants to? Yeah, me. Wants to shoot first? Nadine.
No, because it's really nice to start throwing everything, but is pizza a type of pasta, right? I mean, we need to draw the line somewhere. When you are categorizing, you are accepting that there is an umbrella that combines characteristics for all the boxes and all the categories that still remain in the same way. The writing systems are writing systems. We need to remember that scripts are, most of them, writing systems. Some of them are not. But emojis are pictorial. It's a completely different set of, like if you look at biology and you have the species, and then you have, I forgot the names. Last time I studied biology, I was 14, but you have like animals, and then under animals, you have all the dogs, and then you have the different types of dogs, that type of branch. So there is some form of written identification and communication that would be emoji and letter forms as script systems that we are discussing today. But the emojis live separately, right? They have their own world because we're not writing the emojis. Well, you could put them a category, but it's not a category on the same level as serif and sans serif and all of those other things.
Okay.
Because it's the same for symbol fonts as well. They live with symbol fonts. They don't live with the ABC.
Well, I know a restaurant in Paris that has a pizza which has spaghetti on top.
Hybrids. We always need to leave space for hybrids. I love French fries on pizza. I had that in Cagliari one time. So in Sardinia. So.
Whoa. Calm down, Nadine. Calm down. This is not a cuisine talk. We have to be careful here. Same goes for emoji, and what about color fonts is the new question. What about color fonts? Is it a new category? What about variable fonts which change in design? True variable fonts are many fonts in one, so in one file.
The fact the question is asking about categories is, I think, something we've already addressed. That yes, we can come up with new boxes and put labels on the boxes to put things into, but it's an endless task. People will come up with new things and we'll need new boxes. With variable fonts, we've already come up with the mechanism that we describe the axes and the attributes on the axes, and that allows us to label parts of the design space and to draw boundaries around areas of the design space to describe. So if you have a typeface that, for example, has a serif axis that goes from being sans serif to being serif, in terms of boxes and classification systems, certainly for Latin type, serif and sans has been the two big boxes. And it's one of the problems with classification systems, is that there's this implied duality. If you've got a variable font that goes between them, well, that's fine. We can describe the intermediate steps in terms of where they are on an axis, and we can label some significant places along that axis, going from sans to flared to bracketed serifs to slab serif. I mean, you can actually do quite a lot within a variable design space. So adding more boxes doesn't help you. Describing what's happening in the design space is what helps you. And I think probably the same is true of color fonts, that we just need a language to describe what happens in color fonts.
I think it's also important to differentiate what is a design variable when it comes to the actual formation of the letter form versus the technology with which this letter form is being manifested. And colored fonts is basically a decision on the type designer on the actual specific color and layer of that typeface, but it says nothing about the underlying structure and actual design of the letter forms. A colored font could be, to use these categories that we don't want to use, but anyways, it could be serif, could be sans serif, could be anything. So the colored font is more, it's a design manifestation rather than a design category.
I think a system like the box ATypI would be forced to take all color fonts and throw them into a single bucket, probably along with all of the other graphics.
Why?
And well, because that was the technique that was used in developing the system. You come up with something that is very serif text face centric, and everything else gets thrown into the other buckets. Whereas I think, and obviously it's not the only way to do it, but that's the way Vox ATypI was set up. You could come up with a system that has more boxes, so you could more finely tune things, but you're still, for some people are going to want to look at typefaces that have particular characteristics. And some of those typefaces might be black and white and others might be color. And that's because it isn't the colorness that is important to what you're wanting to look at. Other times you want to say, I only want to see the color fonts. So being able to come at typefaces from different perspectives, depending on what it is that you're looking for and what's important to you for the kind of work that you're trying to do, the kind of design that someone's trying to make, that seems to me requiring something very different from a traditional classification system.
On the question of color fonts, it feels to me that it's the same type of distinction between metal type and letter set papers that you just rub off, the rub off letters, It's a manifestation of the letter in a particular medium for a particular usage, rather than a design that is intrinsic to the shape of the letter form itself.
Okay. Next, we have a question I'm not fully understanding myself because it's missing a verb, which says variable system with axes. So it's a suggestion for a new classification, as I understand it. Which leads to the question that, again, with variable fonts and the fluidity, the liquidity of fonts, making classification even harder. Are axes a good way of describing fonts? That's how I understand the question.
John sort of addressed that, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other. Just call it what it is. It can be whatever's happening in the design space across the axes, really, right?
Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't go with that. I would say that the way I look at it, the way I understand type, and the way I practice it, and I teach it, and I write about it, and I'm in the process of writing something about this particular topic, that's why I'm here, that yes, it needs to be variable, because we have a lot of factors that we can manipulate. So it's like independent variables, right? That we can manipulate, but they're not always on a continuous axis. Sometimes it's a variable with instances that have no relation to one another, but this is the manifestation of how it can vary. So imagine that you have different design variables that cannot be interpolated. You cannot interpolate them. You just need to jump from one into the, it's either this or this. So I think it would make sense to think of, yes, it's a variable system, but the axis is not a continuous axis. It's simply a variable with either a continuation, like width, that is something that can be manipulated with instances that are interpolated all the way through. Optical size, all of these things are things that we can, take and stretch, but there will be instances where we will have variables that cannot be, it's either this or this. And so we just need to keep that in mind.
But even so, within an open type variable font, so this is a particular technology, which is different from being able to classify letter forms when you see them on a page. But I would argue that the axes in a variable font are a form of applied classification. But the classification is not of the letter form, it's a classification of the way in which things can change. So you're saying that you have then an axis, and let's say it's the weight axis. Well, that weight axis is a category of ways in which weight can change as applied in a particular design. And that can, in fact, as Nadine says, be by steps rather than continuous interpolation. You can have breakpoints anywhere along that, but those breakpoints are part of that classification, that part of the way in which weight can change within that design.
I think the questions about variable fonts, in some ways, well, I guess variable fonts put these kinds of ideas closer to the users, but these aren't like new ideas. People have been making type with kind of design variations for decades. So it's not like variable fonts suddenly change how people describe type. It probably more changes how people think about type. And I think that's actually a good thing. One of the problems with the Vox system is that it was very binary. It's like either it's a serif or it's a sans serif, whereas I think it's more helpful, especially if you're talking about a wide range of different typefaces, to be able to describe things in ways that are, I mean, the same way you're talking about food. Like, it's not like it's salty or it's not salty. You can have ranges of saltiness, or music is another good example of like, is this heavy or not heavy? Like, how heavy is it? And I think it's the same with typefaces. And that idea of kind of playing with this gray area, I think actually makes typeface design a lot more interesting in some ways. It kind of pushes the boundaries of what people think are kind of the limits of design, and what happens in the space in between what the kind of established norms of design.
Okay. Back to teaching. Are classifications useful for teaching, really? Are they, really? That's an open question.
I could say, I'm going to echo what Indra said earlier, I think, which is that I don't use a classification to teach, but it's really important to help students, give them the tools to be able to understand the differences between typefaces. And I'm not sure that you need a classification system to do that. You just need to have a set of key reference points. And if you want to introduce some history, some kind of patterns that you might want to talk about, but that's not essential. That's like an additional thing that you might do. In terms of equipping people to negotiate typefaces, they need to be able to recognize difference. So they need to know what to look for, and they need to understand what it means in terms of how they might use typefaces and the context and the implications of that. But no, I don't think you need a classification to do that.
I think it's kind of like any language. If you're teaching someone to be fluent in that language, it's helpful to kind of equip them first with the most useful terms and ideas from the beginning. So I don't really think you need a classification system to do that. Terms are definitely helpful, but like anything, again, this is another problem with the Vox system, is it was kind of a closed system. You learn all the categories and that's all there is. Whereas I think of it a more useful kind of approach is teaching people kind of the biggest, most obvious things that they'll be talking about the most. And as they continue practicing, they learn more terms and more concepts and how to talk about things in more nuanced ways.
I could follow up by also, Walter Tracy said something really nice about this. He wrote Invisible Language. If it was called Visible Language at that point, it was around 1970. And he wrote a really nice article about classification in that. And he talks about how classification is the beginning, even with he worked on the British Standard System or had some kind of limited involvement with it. And he talks about it was a beginning to an end. He understood it was limited, but he said it's a beginning to an end. A classification system is not a reproduction of somebody's entire knowledge. You don't replicate. It gives people a starting point. It was intended as a starting point, and flawed as it was, and I don't think you need a classification. That's what you're seeking to do. You're seeking to give people a set of tools. The tools that they thought were useful was a classification system. The tools that I think are useful, and I think my colleagues here think are useful, are not necessarily a classification, but a key set of terms to help people identify and navigate. And then, like Nick says, they start to find their own granularities and their own kind of paths through stuff. But that's what you're aiming. You want people to become independent.
I would argue, I agree with all of that. Particularly, we're looking at categories as departure points rather than destinations. That really helps change sort of it reframes the narrative, right? That this is a start for us to understand, but not the purpose that in the life cycle of a typeface while you're designing it, and by the time you're done designing it and people have used it, it's not the raison d'etre is not to put it in a box with a specific label, but rather that you have a departure point of a category. But I think it's also important to recognize that even though we don't like Vox, at least I don't like Vox classification system, we do have classification de facto on the ground, right? We talk about serif and sans serif and grotesque and humanist, and the graphic design world also speaks those terms. So those are terms, but these are descriptive categories, right? So they exist, whether we decide we don't want them or not, they exist. But I think it's important to echo what has been said before, that we see this as a departure point and an understanding that these are areas where you can start, and then there's lots of varieties and there's lots of gray areas in the middle.
This is not so much a typographical question, but more almost a philosophical question. Why do we need an order these days? Why are we still trying to? Why having we such difficulties not classifying stuff, not sorting things?
No, this was by me in the sense of do we need an order of the descriptors or the features? And I think we've talked about this before. So if this is all to it, we can skip this, but maybe there's a similar question coming up also.
Oh, how disappointing. I really wish it was a philosophical question.
I was
well, maybe
run at it on
in
those
the aftermath of this with more beer.
Okay, I'll take your word to it. Okay, next question is, all right, I think we've covered that, both questions in one. Okay. Does it make sense trying to find at least a few aspects that are common to any script? There's been some discussions in the chat also about the relationship between the tool, the hand, weight as a descriptor. Is it hopeless to try to find common intersections, common descriptors between scripts, or is there a way to do it? Is there a way to engage into it?
I wouldn't say it's hopeless. I think it's a very complex exercise, and I'm in the middle of trying to sort my head around that. So this is definitely something that lives in my consciousness these days. But I would say that if we sort of put to the side everything we know about writing systems and then go back to the origin of what made the writing systems, so the tool, the hand, the movement, and the medium, and sort of see what type of ingredients they give us. There's a structure that you are following. There is the cut of the nib that would give you contrast, yes or no. There's the axis that would, again, put that contrast in a specific location. The structure in and of itself is a movement of pattern, right? So you can describe the pattern, you can describe the rhythm, you can describe all of these aspects, and irrespective of what you are actually writing. My mentor in Lebanon, his name is Samir Sayegh, he's a calligrapher, he makes paintings of what he calls faux letters. They look like letters, but they're not actually letters, but they echo the principal ingredient of what we find in letter forms, that repetitive rhythm, the thins and the thicks, the tight letters and the wide letters. There is commonality to writing systems. And I think there is beauty in trying to look for those and to help us to enable conversation across the scripts. If it's okay to give an example, when I went to Reading and I was trying to design a Latin and an Arabic that could live together side by side, and it had not been done before, not simultaneously by the same designer, and I didn't know how to do it. And then we had, Jean-François come and give us, a lecture, and then I was discussing this with him, and he was, look at the structure. The structure will give you the answer, and that has been my answer since then. Because if we want to, say, design, scripts that could harmoniously exist with one another, we need this language. Because we need to be able to say, how are we matching? Are we copy-pasting parts of letters? No, we don't want to do that. So then there needs to be a basis for which we can find these commonalities. And we need to recognize that the baseline is not always the same. For example, Arabic is, in the Naskh or in the Thuluth or what else, is inherently more organic than Latin. And we need to recognize where that baseline is. But still, that type of conception of looking at the nature of the movement, the nature of the tool, has, I made my entire career based on trying to analyze those relationships with one another and to understand. And so, yes, it is important that we find these, because in these descriptors, we find the ways to match across scripts, to talk to one another in ways that is not forcing one upon the other, but going back to the basis of writing. So it's not coming from Latin, it's not coming from Arabic, it's not coming from Chinese, it's coming from the pen and paper and the human hand. And those are common to all of us.
I would also add context to that. Sorry, John. Because yes, structure is very important and things having the same feel is very important. But to me, when I see a geometric next to a very uniform Arabic, a very uniform Arabic isn't legible to me. I need those variation in the height of things because I am used to reading in a more naskh style for long text. So I think the danger of doing something like this is that it does not account for context, which, yes, construction very important, context next to it also very important when you're talking about other scripts.
Absolutely. That's why I said there's a baseline. Because that baseline in Arabic is much more organic. That's why, when my clients come to me and they want these, the equivalent of what I did with Frutiger Arabic or what else, and I'm saying, please don't use this more than a few sentences. This is not supposed to be for long text. And I could scream into the void, and you see it set in ways that it's not supposed to do. And I try to explain to them that Arabic is not like Latin, and we can't have this repeat. So context is everything, always.
We could go I think even more abstract than what Nadine was talking about. So Nadine, talk about taking it back to like the tool and the writing system, as it originates in the act of writing. We're talking about shapes, mostly two-dimensional shapes, and we're talking about type, on print or screen. So we have languages of geometry to talk about shapes. We have languages of curves that describe tensions of curves, and we can talk about that using kind of terminology that is about looseness and tightness, for example, or we can actually have mathematical measurements of the tightness of curves, especially since we're talking about digital type, predominantly made with Bezier curves. This is a very specific geometry that we're talking about. So at the level of the analysis of shapes and the way shapes are made, yes, there's absolutely aspects that are common across writing systems, such that we can come up with a common terminology to describe some parts of writing systems. We obviously can't come up with a general overall terminology that's going to work for all writing systems, because there's the things that writing systems have in common, and then there are the things that are specific to individual writing systems. We just need to recognize where that division takes place and where we need to stop using a common terminology and going to something that is specific to an individual writing system to talk about the characteristics that it has, maybe in common with some other writing systems, but not with all other writing systems.
To take it back to just kind of the idea of general language, the question is similar to asking if it makes sense to find some words that are common across different languages. Like there are going to be things that mean the same thing in different languages, and there are going to be things that don't exist in other languages. And I think that's fine. Trying to shoehorn it all into one huge system that covers everything is, you're never going to be able to do it.
But to add to that, I also think you're never going to have a system which is going to deal with, as being discussed in the chat, which is going to deal with all of the different kind of needs of like in terms of the knowledge that people bring to a system. It's as we said at the beginning, context is everything, and knowing what you want. Knowing what you want to describe and why, and whether you want to find something or whether you want to explain something, and who to, matters, because all of those are going to change the emphasis that any kind of approach is going to have. So the idea that there is, I would say that I don't think there is one universal system that's possible. I also don't think it's especially desirable, but yeah, there seems to be, I think, different people, but particularly in the chat, coming from a different position.
All right, this is a question for ATypI, apparently. Why does ATypI as an entity has to attempt this at all? Because there was one before and you want to replace it, not by a void. I think I tried to answer it already. Maybe my fellow board members and ATypI members want to add something. If not, we can move on. So there will be this is recorded. There will be a replay available for the next week, couple of weeks, and then this recording will be put up on YouTube. I'm glad we're talking about the Panelists system. John only briefly mentioned it. The opposite of the Vox system would be the Panelists system, which attempts to classify type designs by their design details and appearance, regardless of origin. It did have a purpose to deal with font substitution across digital systems. Is it useful? Not useful? Well, as a type designer, I have bad memories of wrangling the Panelists system, but For those of you who have an experience using it, maybe you have an opinion of your own about the relevance of the Panelists system.
It would be super useful, but I have not met a person who can use it.
Yeah, and most fonts don't even contain the correct information. I mean, I don't bother with most of those Panos values. I don't think most type designers do, probably because they aren't used in many places.
They can break your font if they're not correct sometimes, though. Like if the weight Panos, for example, is not matching your OS2 weight, I have seen instances where style linking can break when your Panos isn't working correctly. So I do think it's very important to have proper Panos set up, but maybe a good question, returning to a question before, is what do you do with the Panos of a variable font? Is everything anything if it's not just one thing? Maybe that's an interesting thing, but I do like that the Panos system looks at parameters rather than, although it is still very Latin centric, right? There's still like, sit down and calculate what kind of serif it is, or measure your O and tell us what the transition is like. So yeah,
it's extremely Latin centric. I mean, more so. I mean, Vox, you can kind of imagine how it applies to Cyrillic type, even to some Greek type. Panos is based specifically on measurements of a subset of Latin letters. If your font doesn't contain those Latin letters, you actually cannot generate accurate Panos information because you haven't got the things that it relies upon. So you just have to kind of guess what the values, applicable values would be. As Indra and Nick pointed out, the data in most fonts is either incorrect or has been deliberately set to the most general setting, which is that most of the classifications are the any box. And that's a way to kind of avoid it, breaking things. I've done a few typeface families in which the clients wanted me to provide fully accurate Panos information. And I did it the old-fashioned way, which was actually I went in and measured things and did the calculations manually. I had a long conversation with Dave Opstad, then at Apple, later at Monotype, about a tool he had tried to work on to automate accurate Panos information. So basically something that would plug into a font development tool to actually do the measurements and the calculations for you. And I'm sure other people have tried to work on this as well. He gave up on it as being kind of too difficult and not really worthwhile. It would be interesting, I think, for any descriptive system of typeface, to be able to be automatable. To be able to point a tool at a font and have it get you at least kind of 90% of the way there in terms of describing and then possibly generating tags based on the description. That would be an interesting project to do. And it would at least mean that, more of the data would be consistent between typeface families, rather than it just being left to the individual font makers to try to come up with tags or come up with ways of describing their own typefaces in ways that are very subjective and based on their own interpretations of what things mean.
Okay, thanks for contribution. New question is, do you think that any classification system should be limited only to the graphic form of writing system? Does language influence of letter form? For example, should the attitude towards existing hieroglyphic and phonetic scripts be the same?
Am I the only one who doesn't completely understand this question?
I'm thinking it's somehow similar to the emoji and symbol kind of questions.
It seems like it's a bigger picture kind of question of like, if you're trying to set up a group of terms or some glossary, like at what point do you stop talking about type? Do you stop talking about text, graphemes? Like there's kind of a range of things you can include in that discussion. In terms of ATypI, it seems like you'd want to stick mostly with type stuff, but it's like at what point do you stop adding things to the dictionary? You can just kind of keep going on forever. But I think it's part of the idea of a more focused and specific list of terms or a glossary is that you can get very deep instead of going very wide, and that can be helpful.
Yeah, why stop at all? Because things change and evolve, and there's new things, right? I go back to the animal kingdom a lot, but what happens to an animal that evolves and outgrows, stops having wings? It doesn't stop being a thing, and it maybe doesn't belong in the same sort of category that it was in before. So, yeah, it's not like we're at the limit for space anymore. So.
Okay, I think it's safe to say we can move on to the next question. Oh, AI. Maybe we should step back and ask us how AI would classify organize fonts. Maybe it's not a tag or category-based system. Maybe it is more flexible and related to the questions the users ask. So should we let AI organize the fonts?
The data is as good as what you give it.
That's the issue with AI, how you train the model.
Yeah, which users do you present it with and their responses?
And is it human readable? Because it can come up with categories that we don't even understand, they're just code. And it will understand them, but we won't. So
there are certainly instances where I can imagine AI could be helpful if you're trying to group things based on kind of semi-objective visual traits, kind of what John was talking about. But that's not going to cover all of the things that you want to be able to use when you're talking about letter forms and type.
Yeah, it kind of misses off the sort of cultural artifacts and the kind of context of use, and so it depends. As we keep saying, the very boring answer: it depends on when. I mean, I think one of my favorite examples of and it's a rare thing to say this, one of my favorite examples of a successful classification system is the one that David Shields did for the Rob Roy Kelly archive. It was a finite, focused project, and rereading some of the online discussions, there was a piece by Robin Kinross from 2003-ish in that initial, once the initial announcement was made about the de-adoption, unadoption, I can't remember what the word is, of the Vox. There was a kind of flurry of past debates talking about the ridiculousness of sort of terms from the 19th century. But in the context of what David Shields was trying to do, it made complete sense, because it was a classification of a finite set of things, and he used the terms, and it works really well. In fact, it's really disappointing that they're not still using it as a system for organizing the website. So just when you have a specific goal, a specific set of criteria, a set of objectives, then I think these things kind of can become interesting and possible, and enable people to do, well, whatever it is that you want to do, find material in an archive, or start to elaborate and elucidate somebody's writing about a period in history, which is, I guess, what David was trying to do. I think when things just become very open-ended, then it becomes far more difficult.
One of my favorite systems for organizing type is the photo lettering, the old photo lettering books. And they're kind of indexed, and the way they organize their whole catalog. Maybe Jean-Baptiste can pull one out. I have one here, but it's kind of playful, but it's very useful, especially if you're just kind of a graphic designer. And they had very memorable terms, and it was the way that it was sorted was in some ways it's hard to describe or quantify the things that tie together certain sections or when you're jumping from one typeface to another, but you could see it and understand it. And I think it was very accessible in a way that a lot of these other type organization systems aren't even close to.
But if I remember correctly, it also worked a lot with prototypical models of a field, like the Clarendons, the Coopers, the Dingsbums. Yep. So if you don't know anything about that, then it's not useful or helpful at all. So it is sort of like naive in one degree, but also very expert. I mean, it sets on to a certain basis of a vocabulary of typefaces that you have to know.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me smile, though, and I don't know, but I think that's increasingly an important characteristic of a classification system for me. I think ones that make me smile could be like an added quality that we bring to this.
And I think the level that that it relied on your existing knowledge of kind of the prototypical typeface designs, like the Clarendons and things like that. I think it was low enough of a level that most people who were kind of working graphic designers had at least some understanding. And if they couldn't, the thing that's really cool about, other than the kind of system that they developed, is the sidebars where they had little descriptions. You know, if it was kind of an obscure concept, they had little blurbs talking about what exactly it meant. And even if you didn't read those, you could just look, in the way that they're sorted and grouped, like visually, you could understand like what this term means.
I worry that if we got AI to the point where it was classifying and organizing fonts in ways that were actually useful and also, you know, new and different from what a human being might do, we would also be at the point at which AI could design all our new typefaces for us.
I think we need to keep that in mind. There's a really good book, I actually have it just over there. It's called AI Superpowers. It's about the US versus China competition in artificial intelligence. And there's disagreements about how many jobs will be replaced by AI. You know, there's some people who say 9%, some people who say 50 or 40 or 30, but, you know, between 30 and 40 seems to have more of a consensus between experts in the field. No one will ever know. But I think this is something that all of us will need to keep in mind, especially that we do already use automation in our type design. Interpolated instances is a form of automation, right? The optics in design is a form of automation as well. So part of our design processes already bring automation. And I think one thing that might not be able to be automated is the ability of type to be an expressive tool and a way to bring color and value to words. And this is where our understanding as type designers of what our socioeconomic, cultural, political background is asking us, what the people want to say to give form to those expressions. This is where we as humans can still bring value, right? But the fact that there will be more and more automation, not necessarily to replace the type designer, but become part of the process so that we do less manual work. But that part of the expression, I think it will still be human, I hope.
I'm not even convinced of that. Tom Scott, who does very interesting YouTube videos, he recently had AI write scripts for him based upon his previous documentaries. you have the AI come up with topics and then actually generate the script. And there's a huge amount of junk and noise that gets produced in that process, but there's also nuggets of gold. And he actually ends up, filming one of the scripts for his completely fantastical thing that the AI has invented. And it is compelling, and it is interesting, and it is all the things that we look for in human creativity. It's just that, it's a documentary about a thing that never actually existed or happened because it's been invented by this AI system.
Jean-Baptiste, you're on mute. This sentence has to be said in every Zoom or video conference, no? So we check it on the bingo card.
Oh, you muted, Jean-Baptiste?
Yes. Well, that was fun. So what systems have been created to classify or sort type designs in other script communities around the world? Do you have experience with other initiatives that are not Western-centric, Latin-centric?
So there's a little bit in Arabic. I recently wrote an article, and so there's been different attempts in Arabic. It's not like we've all agreed. And if you put 10 Arabs, you'll get 11 opinions. So, and that we haven't even gone more to the other, nations that use the Arabic script. So it's not that this is agreed or anything, but generally we reference the calligraphic style, but then there is this neo that gets to be added on top. But recently, I wrote an article about new design spaces in Arabic. One of the term, for example, that I was using is rounded naskh rather than naskh. Naskh in general, most of the closed loops are triangular in shape, and there is a tendency these days to round them up. And so, you come more towards rounded naskh. And so, but the starting point starts with the calligraphic style. In Latin, you would perhaps start with Carolingian and then, that type. So, but that's it that I know of in Arabic.
Yeah, same. We usually just start from the basis of because the calligraphy is so rich. There's so many established different styles. The thing that usually falls outside of them is actually either the new things that have come up with type, which are the simplified NAS styles and the sort of the uniform styles. But beyond that, it's usually, there's some really strong calligraphic base for it. Or it's, a really display sort of handwritten style, but even then, the sort of the contrast logic usually follows, even if it's structured. So yeah, I would absolutely agree that for Arabic, it usually goes back to calligraphy, but I really can't speak to most other scripts. But I think, where there is a lack of maybe a lot of typographic history, there will usually be more reference to calligraphy. That would logically follow for me. That seems to make sense to me, but of course, that's still a presumption on my part.
In Thai, there is the looped and the non-looped versions, but that's also a little bit of a misnomer, like serif and sans serif, because the differences between looped and non-looped is not just that you have the loops. So the ones that don't have loops are a little bit more Latinized. There is a bit more of a formal construction of the letter forms, and the non-loop and the looped are more closer to the handwritten manual feel of the calligraphy. In Chinese, I think they have names. I don't know enough about Chinese to be able to tell the difference, but they would have this category is called this and this category is called that. But more of the formal qualities. But if you look rather than as how the approach that we take in Arabic and in a couple of others, the approach is going back to the original structure, because the calligraphic forms are coming from the structure that calligraphic style typically takes and the associated proportions with it. So it would be naskh whether it was high contrast or low contrast. In any case, it would still be naskh if you put the tarwis, that some people would call serif, but it's not a serif. If you put a tarwis or you don't put a tarwis, it's still naskh. Contrast or no contrast is still naskh. Big counter, small counter, still naskh. Big finials or small finials, still naskh, because the underlying structure and the logic of construction is still the same. So it's a little bit different from the approach that Latin takes, which is more of a post hoc, this is what we're going to call them. We're going to call them all grotesques because they are grotesquely ugly, right? Or we're going to call them sans serifs because they don't have the feet on, which is a little bit of a different approach. If you were to take the Arabic approach in Latin, the Bodoni and the grotesques would sit in the same category because the construction is so similar.
That model of applying the Arabic terms to types in a structural way. So you could say that a low contrast design could still be classified as a naskh based on its structure. That's taken the terms away from the way in which they're used in the calligraphic tradition, where the proportion is key alongside of the structure, but then also size. So one of the things I like about the Arabic scribal tradition is that each of the classical styles not only has a characteristic structure, but has associated cultural associations of size and use, such that the difference between naskh and thuluth are to do with size, and one we might think of as a display and the other one as text, but they and there's some variation in this, and you get people playing with these conventions. So you sometimes find like giant Qurans all in thuluth because they just have magnificent size of text. When that gets translated into type, though, especially into scalable digital type, where things can be any size and things can have any adjustable proportions, that process why the word neo getting added on seems a bit of a cop-out. I think the terms neo-naskh and neo-kufic have been overused and have basically become a bit like the other category in traditional classification systems.
Yeah, I think it again goes back to that thing of context as well, right? Like a big thing that separates naskh and thuluth for me beyond size is context. Thuluth is religious. It is inherently used in religious contexts, and that's where you expect to see it. Not to say that it can't be used anywhere else. That's very, that's a very limited view of it, but you still expect it. You don't expect to read ever in thuluth, not necessarily because of the size, but because of, like Nadine said, there are things that are just inherent to some calligraphic styles. It is very long ascenders. That's a defining characteristic of it. It's not like Latin where you can play with X height and ascenders. No, in thuluth you have the high ascend, the aleph, the lam, they're just tall, like very unapologetically tall. So yeah, as you say, regionally things can change, but context becomes so important to it as well.
Context is, I think it's really interesting as an aspect of thinking about how we describe typefaces. I'm really struck, and I was always really struck when I learned a little bit about some of the associations of particular Arabic scripts and uses, that the same is true of really early types and some of the written hands that they were derived from. So particularly some of the sort of more cursive broken scripts that would be particularly associated with use in this kind of prayer book or that kind of book or this kind of book, but not in that kind of book, or only for vernacular languages and not for Latin. So there was a very particular context of use or application for scripts, which we've lost a little bit more as we've gone forwards. But achieved typefaces that are developed particularly for use in newspapers or for particular printing contexts that have particular features that were, it's a kind of a temptation to think about starting to wonder, do you integrate aspects of use in the description? Because it can explain why things look the way that they do, if explaining is a part of what you want to do.
I think this is absolutely important. And I think what would be interesting is also to track like changing aesthetics over time and the changing preferences in parallel to the formal qualities. Like we know in Germany during the interwar years, and at some point fracture was banned, at some point it was not. The sans serif had one meaning and then it had another. So these are like major political statements that have been forced upon typography. And it's the same for regional differences between other scripts as well. And for example, type in and of itself can become a symbol for subjugation of certain cultures over another. So, and I'm speaking here very tentatively because it's not my area of expertise, but like the Bulgarian specific variants when it comes to Cyrillic versus the Russian variants when it comes to Cyrillic. So there are these, contextual qualities that are very important to keep in mind, and the sensitivities that come with them. But they change over time as well. And so this is quite interesting to have as a layer rather than, so in parallel coming together and always keeping in mind what is going on. One of the favorite sessions I had when I was at Reading was with Michael Twyman, when he was talking about, the historical context as to why letter forms evolved the way they do and what was happening in relation to, what was going on at that period in time. And so this is definitely something nice to keep in mind.
We are approaching the end of this panel. We have probably time for one or two more questions. Okay, systems by definition cannot do anything more than observe what happened. Isn't it possible for a unit design to make something that does not fit any system that's created, or more strongly, isn't that the core role of designers? I'm not sure I understood. But
I think it's to do with perhaps hybrid. So I would agree. So for example, when I designed Frutiger Arabic, there was nothing that looked like Frutiger Arabic. It's a hybrid between Naskh and Kufi. And it hadn't existed before. I invented it. And then I continued to refine that style. And now it's there. It's part of the language, right? And many other designers have done that as well. It's so I think those it depends on what approach you take, fixed approach or growth approach. If you come to type design thinking that all of the possible typefaces have been drawn and these are all the categories and you just sit in one of these rooms and draw, then you're not really adding. And some people will have amazing careers sitting in a few existing rooms and being brilliant in those rooms. And there will be designers who are interested in breaking walls and making doors between the rooms and sitting more on the barrier. And I think there is space for both. And it would be a disservice to say that type designers have to invent something new in order to leave their mark in history, because they don't have to. You could be just brilliant in something that already exists. But there will be ones who will want to open that space, and we need to recognize the role of both.
Okay, and this is, well, that was fun. So maybe the last question before we wrap this up. Some questions to think about when talking about this topic. Who's the main beneficiary from a classification system? The Western hegemony, capitalism, the scripts themselves, etc. I think it's important to unpack who's asking for it and why. So we don't know who's the I in I think it's important, but Can you maybe address some of the concerns about who's the beneficiary of a classification system?
Well, I think we mentioned this or touched upon this a couple of times when we talked about that we have to say or like specify, at least for ourselves, who's going to use this. So who's going to benefit from this is sort of like the user, I hope, because we're not doing this for the sake of, because we love to come up with more boxes and buckets than we are the users or the beneficiary of. And that's also, I think, why there has to be many different approaches for the researchers, for a type seller, for students or beginning users of type, or lay people who want to, we all want to convince to license more typefaces so that everyone can have more money. So it's of course also capitalism in the end. So I think any of the listed people and everyone who was mentioned deserve their own approach that they can find what they were looking for. And I think we probably all agree that this is not going to be solved by one thing that we can put on our wall, like a static drawing of something, but it has to be dynamic in some way.
I think we also, to extend, like it's about asking who benefits, but that's about thinking about an audience, which is what a designer would do. But it's also about thinking about the negative consequences, like who, who's going to suffer as a consequence of you knowing something or doing something? So, you know, where's the positive and where's the negative? Well, you know, where's the I've learned this, therefore, who's being deprived of something? All of these things are in a kind of a relationship. So, yeah, unpacking the kind of implicit power structures going on with any kind of system like this is really important.
We could say if we don't find a way for users to choose typefaces more sensibly, then we're all stuck with a new default font for Microsoft or Calibri, or everyone is just using the thing with A and the top of the menu. So, I mean, also the world will not end, but we also want to teach students or designers that they design coherent work so that the font choice corresponds with the message, and it also has to function in a way that not everything has to like be in a fine display font or something. But I cut off Nick, sorry.
Going back, no, that's fine. To Catherine's point, and also an earlier question about whether ATypI should even be bothering to do this, maybe one argument that it could be helpful for ATypI to be working on something in this realm, probably not like a strict classification system, but something, is that ATypI is a much bigger network of people around the world, and is probably better suited for looking at some of these kind of gaps in, you know, who's benefiting and who's not benefiting, than if it was just, you know, one or two people doing it. And granted, ATypI isn't the most global organization in the world, but in the context of the type community, it's one of the more internationally kind of spread out.
I think asking the question who benefits, or maybe, you know, as Catherine said, you know, doesn't benefit, who is possibly harmed. It's very difficult to incorporate those, you know, they're the things we need to know and we need to be aware of. The things that are difficult to incorporate into the design of a system. You know, you can't try to design a system that is only going to, you know, be a benefit to certain people who we think should be benefited. There's always, in any system, there's free riders, there's unexpected consequences. You make a thing, a very good example actually is secure communications. Big topic at the moment. You know, there's governments who want to be able to hack into communications, and they say, well, you know, fully secure communications benefits terrorists. Yes, it does. It also benefits everybody else. And you have to make decisions about, you know, making systems that benefit the most number of people taking into account that some of the people who are going to benefit from that aren't necessarily people who you would like to see benefited. Or in terms of typeface classification, particularly applied classification and description. So, for example, you've got a system, it's going to benefit that student who needs to figure out something and find a font to use in the project that they're working on that needs to be turned in tomorrow. That same system is going to benefit, say, a monotype shareholder. You need the system to benefit people. You can't control whom it benefits.
And this would be the last word. Thank you, everybody who participated. I'm sorry we have to wrap this up. You have two options offering themselves to you. You can either join the Hangout space if you want to continue the conversation and ask the questions that weren't asked during this session. We were only able to ask half of the questions you've asked. Thank you very much for your contribution. Your other option is to join the ATypI Tech Talks Slack channel. You must have received an email with a link to connect to this channel. Once again, I would like to thank our panelists. You've been great. Thank you for your time, your expertise, your insights. That was super valuable. And I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Same for the audience. Thank you for being here. We only lost 30% of the audience along the way. That's for the record. So it's a pretty good score. And you should be proud of it because Maximilian is proud of you. Thank you to our panelists. Thanks to the audience. Thanks the tech team and our board, my fellow board members, my beloved president. See you soon on the Slack channel or on the Hangout space. And in any case, see you tomorrow for the third day. Cheers.